Good morning, students. Welcome to the science class. We have already discussed the topic of structure of flower and types of flower in the previous lecture. The main objective of today's topic are types of pollination and agents of pollination. And this topic is on page number 23 and 24. The main terms we will learn in this topic are pollination, self-pollination, cross-pollination, entomophily, anemophily, hydrophily, and ornithophily. First is introduction. The primary requirement for sexual reproduction is the complete fusion of male and female gametes by the process called fertilization. And fertilization is the fusion of male and female gamete to produce zygote. But the male and female gamete producing structures, pollen grains and ovules respectively, are born on different parts of the flower. The pollen grains must be transferred from anthers to the stigma of carpel to bring about fertilization. In this diagram, you can see pollen grains are transferred from an anther to stigma of a flower. And this transfer of pollen grains from an anther to stigma of a flower is called pollination. Now student, come to the page number 23 and start the reading of this chapter. Pollination is process of transfer of pollen grains from an anther to stigma of a flower. There are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Now let's discuss about the types of pollination. Self-pollination. Self-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flower or another flower of the same plant. In this picture, you can see pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of same flower, and this kind of pollination is called self-pollination. Self-pollination is also called autogamy. Second is cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same kind. In this picture, you can see pollen grains are transferred from anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower. And this kind of pollination is called cross-pollination. And cross-pollination is also called allogamy. We know in cross-pollination, pollen grains from the anther of one flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower. The pollen grains need some agents. There are two types of agent, abiotic agent and biotic agent. Abiotic mean non-living and biotic mean living. Abiotic agents like wind and water, and biotic agents like bird, insects and bat. And these agents help to transport and bring about pollination. And the most common agents are wind and insects. Now student, come to the page number 24. Agents of pollination. First is entomophily, pollination by insect. Anemophily, pollination by air. Hydrophily, pollination by water. Ornithophily, pollination by bird. Now let's discuss agents of pollination in detail. First is entomophily. Entomo mean insects and phily mean pollination. Students, in this diagram you can see pollen grains are transferred from an anther to stigma of a flower through the agency of insects. And this type of pollination is called entomophily. Student, come to the page number 24 and start the reading of this topic. Entomophily. It is the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower through the agency of insects. The insects visit the flowers for its edible pollen grains or nectar or shelter against rain, heat, or cold, or for laying eggs. Nectar means sweet fluid secreted within the flower. While performing these activities, they also perform pollination. The common insects which help in pollination are bees, butterflies, flies, beetles. Bees are the most common pollinators. What are the characteristics of insect pollinated plants? First is flowers are beautiful and showy and they have brightly colored corolla. Why they are having a brightly colored corolla? To attract the insects for pollination. Students, correct the spelling of colored. Colored. Second is they have sweet scented floral parts. Third is flowers are small in size. Fourth is they have nectar glands that secrete nectar and attract the insects for pollination. Next is they produce pollen grains in small quantities. The insects visit these flowers to eat the pollen grains which serve as food for them. Next is the pollen grains and stigma have sticky surface. Examples are salvia and sunflower. Second is anemophily. Anemo mean air, phily mean pollination. Students, in anemophily, pollen grains are transferred from anther to the stigma of flower through the agency of wind. Anemophily, the process of transfer of pollen grains from the anthers to the stigma of another flower through the agency of wind. Now, what are the characteristics of wind pollinated flowers? First is they don't have nectar. Second is flowers are colorless, odorless, and not showy. Third is they don't have calyx and corolla. Calyx mean group of sepals and corolla mean group of petals. Fourth is plants generally grow in groups. Fifth is pollen grains are light in weight and dusty so that they can easily sway with the wind. Sixth is they produce a large number of pollen grains because of high wastage. Seventh is stigma are hairy and long and feathery. They are well exposed to catch wind-borne pollens. Examples are wheat and maize. Hydrophily. Hydro mean water. Phily mean pollination. Hydrophily is the transfer of pollen grains to the stigma of another plant which occurs through the agency of water. Now, what are the characteristics of water pollinated plants? First is pollen grains are long, filamentous, unwettable, and swim under the water. Second is the male flower get detached and float on the surface of water. Detached means separate. Third is the stigma of the flower is large, sticky, and well exposed. The pollination by water may occur above or under the surface of water. It occurs in some aquatic plants. Examples are Vallisneria and Hydrilla. Students, in Vallisneria, pollination is very interesting. The female flower have long stalks, whereas male flower have short stalks and are submerged. Submerged means completely under the water. Before pollination, the male flowers detach from the parent plant and they are carried by water currents up to the female flower. In this way, pollination takes place. In Vallisneria, male flowers are submerged in water, while female flowers with long stalk float on water surface. At maturity, male flowers get detached from plants. Detached means separate and float on the surface of water. When these flowers come in contact with female flowers, then the pollen grains are shed onto the stigma of female flower and thus pollination takes place. Next is ornithophily. Ornitho means birds, phily means pollination. In ornithophily, pollen grains are transferred from anther to a stigma of a flower through the agency of birds. Ornithophily. Pollination by birds is brought about in large number of plants. Examples are bombax, begonia, canna, small sunbirds and hummingbirds while feeding edible pollen and nectar also perform pollination. Student, do you know hummingbirds pollinates the begonia flowers? Now, what are the characteristics of bird pollinated plants? First is the flowers are present in groups. Second is they are showy and brightly colored or produce abundant nectar for the attraction of birds. Next is the pollen grains are produced in large quantities so as to ensure the process of pollination. Floral parts are thick and leathery and they have funnel shaped corolla. In plants which are pollinated by bats, the flowers have strong odor to attract the nocturnal birds as they are unable to see at night. Nocturnal birds are the birds that are active at night time. Friends, I hope you have understood this topic. Now you must be able to solve the following question. First is give two differences between self and cross pollination. Second is define pollination and entomophily. Third is what are the characteristics of wind pollinated flower. And last is give an example of flower pollinated by water. So student, we have completed the discussion of this topic. We will continue by tomorrow. Thank you very much.